Welcome to our latest edition of Chestnut Chat. I am recording, so if you put anything in the chat, if you put anything in Q&A, it's going to be recorded, and Sharon, who is joining me today, is going to post that to the website. So just be aware of that. If you are not me or Sharon, then we can't hear you or see you. So like I said, we've got about 150 people joining us today. So welcome and thank you for coming. Today it's just me. Usually I try to invite lots of other folks to join us and share their expertise. Today I'm going to be talking about site selection and planting of American chestnuts. My name is Sara Fitzsimmons. I'm the Director of Restoration with the American Chestnut Foundation, and I work out of our Penn State Partnership Office. I've been doing this work for about 20 years. I started as an intern back in 1999, 2000, working with the Pennsylvania chapter, and have been around since. So planted a lot of chestnuts, lost a lot of chestnuts, learned a lot in the process, and so I'm going to share as much of that with you as I can. Sharon is joining us. Sharon, do you want to tell folks who you are? Because I think this is your first time to showcase and being.
Back at the beginning, back in the day, I think I did, but it was more of a learning bystander.
Okay.
So
well, tell us who you are.
So I'm Sharon Marmon-Sachs, and I work out of the Asheville office. I'm the operations manager. So I am part of the support team for all the wonderful science that goes on, and I learn so much at every Chestnut Chat. And so I welcome everyone, and today will be as wonderful as they always are. So back to you, Sara.
Thank you, Sharon. So because it's just me, Sharon's going to help answer questions as she can and monitor the chat. If you want to make a comment, if you want to say something, throw it in the chat. If you have a question, please put that in the Q&A, because that helps us keep things together a little bit closely. As I'm giving the talk, I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat or the questions. So Sharon, if you see something that needs to, really extreme clarification, interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm going to save everything to the end and try to get as many questions as we can. So buckle up. We've got a lot of territory to cover today. What I'm going to cover today, I'm really going to focus on site selection. That's really the most important factor in terms of planting chestnuts. I mean, the actual act of putting the trees in the ground is important, but if you don't have the good site, and at worst case scenario you pick the bad site, you're going to have a bad time. So I'm going to focus a lot on site selection. I'm going to touch on a little bit about actually getting the trees in the ground. I'm not going to cover like pests, diseases. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about deer and things like that. That's obviously a very big part of planting and growing these things, but we'll save that for another session. We just don't have enough time to cover all of that. So that was a long preamble. I'm going to share my screen. All right, do site selection. Actually, you know what? I need to share my screen because I'm going to give you guys some a tour of some tools, some web tools that I like to use too. All right, so like I said, site selection is the most important step in planting anything, including chestnut. And soils is obviously the major component of figuring out what site is good. I look at physical characteristics like drainage, texture, something called saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is related to permeability. Also something like swales, frost pockets, things like that takes to knowing your own site. And then also maybe the chemical composition of your soil. That is important, but not nearly as important as the physical characteristics of your soil. In general, soils that are appropriate for chestnut are well drained, have high saturated hydraulic conductivity. So drainage is the ability of water to get in the soil, and saturated hydraulic conductivity, which I'm going to call KSAT. KSAT is the ability of water to move through the soil. So you want water to get in the soil really fast, but you also want it to move through the soil really fast. You also want the soil to be acidic, and generally your pH of 4.5 to 6.5 is sort of the good range. Preferred is about 5.5. They will grow below 4.5. They will grow above 6.5. They just won't grow as well, and you will tend to have more issues like stunting, yellowing of the leaves, curled, and they'll grow slow. Good indicator plants are ericaceous species. So things like mountain laurel, blueberry, rhododendron, these are similar plants that like well-drained acidic soils, highly permeable, rocky, sandy acidic soils. So you don't have to have these growing by, but these are just good indicators that the soil is generally also going to be good for chestnut. What does soil look like? Have you ever dug a soil pit? It's actually pretty fascinating to look at, or like a road cut. You can see, maybe the soil. Usually you're going to see rocks, but sometimes you can see the soil layers. So the O layer is the duff layer, or that organic layer where you've got decomposing leaves and the things like that, and you want that to be actually pretty thick. That's going to give you lots of good nutrition. Your and then your R horizon is bedrock. And sometimes we're going to talk a lot about that, bedrock and a depth to what's called, oh, my internet connection is unstable. So depth to bedrock or depth to fragipan, these things are going to be really important in terms of how deep your soil is. So it's not, you want a really deep O layer, it's not going to be more than a few inches. And you want a lot of unfettered access for roots to get through, and also for water to get through. All right, and then this is just two different kinds of soil. So you can see here on the left, a very high clay layer, and on the right you've got a much deeper sandy layer, and then even 50 inches down you've got this deep, dark, rich, nutrient-rich soil. If I were going to plant in something, I would pick that soil on the right. So again, I'm going to repeat myself a lot and kind of talk about certain things that you're going to look for when selecting a site. Particle size. Particle size is it silt, sand, or clay? And that's going to determine the ability of that soil to hold water, for the water to get in and to get out. You want to look at depth to impermeable layer. So how deep is that soil for the roots to get through? And examples of impermeable layers are fragipan, bedrock, water table, or even compaction, which is related to fragipan, but not quite the same thing. We look at nutrient availability, and you can do that through a soil test. That's, nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium, and then the ability of the soil to hold nutrients, and that's measured through the cation exchange capacity, or CEC, and again, that's provided by a soil test. Texture. Number one important thing that I want y'all to look at when planting chestnut. So there's three different particles. There's silt, sand, and clay. And through a recent habitat suitability model that we had a standback intern from Duke just completed, that should be published very soon. He took all of the known locations of American chestnuts, threw that down on various geographic layers, precipitation, temperature, aspect, slope, and sand. One of the major factors in determining where chestnuts grow and where they don't is percent sand. So in that model, about 25 to 30% of chestnut location prediction is percent sand. And what he found was your sweet spot is between 25% and 75% sand. Less than 25% sand, you're not going to get that high KSAT. Greater than 75% sand, it's too well drained. The water doesn't stay in enough. That doesn't mean that chestnuts won't grow in less than 25 or higher than 75. It just means that you're going to be fighting for them to grow and do well. And I'm going to repeat that a lot too. All of these are guidelines, and that doesn't mean that chestnuts won't grow outside of that. It just means that you're fighting an uphill battle, or that the trees aren't going to grow as well as they could in other sort of, within the guidelines. But in general, I'm going to tell you that you really should shoot for 25 to 75% sand. That's going to give you a better, you're going to have a better time if you're within that those ranges. For those of you who aren't familiar with particle sizes, gravel, and I'll say too, for chestnut, the students' model didn't take into account gravel, but I have seen chestnuts grow in rocks, and we've got a lot of them in Pennsylvania. For those of you who hike, you might know the term Rocksylvania. I mean, that is a true term that I have a lot of experience with, and my ankles do too. But so Gravels are, sort of your biggest particle size, and as long as you have some area for root connection, chestnuts can grow in very gravelly soils, and there are even soils called gravelly loams or sandy gravel, and chestnuts can grow well in there. Then you have sand, which is a little bit smaller, silt, and then clay. Clay is your smallest particle. They fit together very tightly. They hold on to water. They don't let water in very fast. And then when they get water, they don't let it go. So you have you tend to have poor drainage and poor permeability in high clay soils because of their particle size. All right. How do you know what your particle size is? Well, most soil analysis laboratories will do it for you. They will, if you send them a sample based on how they tell you, usually it's between $15 and $25 for them to tell you the exact makeup of your soil and soil texture. You can also do it at home. You can get a mason jar, fill it with, and this website tells you how to do this particle size test, but you fill it with about a cup or two of soil, depending on the size of your mason jar. Fill it all the way up to the top with water and like a couple drops of dish soap, shake it up, and then let it settle out for about a day. And then you can determine all of your larger particles will settle to the bottom. Your clay will settle in the middle, and then the water will go to the top. And so in this example of the soil, and I don't know what soil this is, but you see about 66% of it is sand and silt mixed together. It doesn't give you a real nice separation of sand and silt. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So if you have sort of an iffy type of soil, you might want to send it away for a better analysis. But this is something that you can do at home and at least get a first approximation of what's in your soil. And if it's all clay, I would recommend finding another spot. So a couple of other terms that you're going to encounter as you look at soil, as you look at sites and to select a site. Porosity, that's the measure of void space. That's how much area that water has to move through, and also roots have to move through. Drainage, it roughly indicates the degree, frequency, and duration of wetness, how water can get in the soil, and then how long it stays in there. Saturated hydraulic conductivity, also called KSAT, or also called permeability, is the ability of water to flow through the soil. And you may have heard of something called a perk test. And people do that a lot of times when they establish things like septic tanks or when they're putting in a foundation. And I recommend that you do a modified perk test when you're examining a site for chestnut. And so the perk test that I recommend you do, and I'm going to mention this again, but is that you basically dig a hole that's a foot deep and a foot wide, fill it with water, and then see how long it takes for the water to get through. If it drains really quickly, if it drains out in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, you're good to go. Chestnuts will grow well. If it takes 20 to 30 minutes, you're in a marginal site. If it takes more than a half an hour, and even I've seen sites where it takes more than a day, find another site. And again, you can do these multiple times and kind of get an average. And I've had some people get really conflicting results, and that's fine. I would try it a couple different times, see if you can figure out what's going on, and also use it in combination with some of these other tools to get a better indication of what's going on at your given site. There's something called a ribbon test too that you can do with soil. And so I like doing this. It's kind of fun. You dig up some of your soil at different, and also be sure to do it at different depths so that you can determine how many of these different components are at different depths in your soil. So if it doesn't form a ribbon at all, so if you grab some soil and you kind of pinch it between your fingers and you try to form a ribbon, you try to get it to form, I mean, as if you were working with clay and trying to form a pot, right? If it doesn't do that at all, then it's a sand or a loamy sand. If it can't, and that's great. That's what you want for chestnut, right? If you form a ribbon but it breaks really soon, and it feels gritty, then you've got sort of a sandy loam, silt loam. If it forms a ribbon 1 to 2 inches long or longer, you're in an area that has too much clay. And again, it's not, I can't tell you that it's within that 25 or 75% or outside of that within sand, but I still probably wouldn't plant in there. This is, again, another approximation of what's going on in your soil. Use this as a tool with these other types of tests to get a sense of what's going on at your given site. All right, so we talked about texture. Let's talk about depth to impermeable layer. So you may have the most perfect site. It may be, 50% sand and look gorgeous and be easily accessible and have great access to water, but maybe there's a lot of compaction. Maybe it was a log landing. Maybe it's an old construction site. Maybe the depth to bedrock, and I've worked on sites like this, and that's what this picture is, not a site that I've worked on, but it's a site where the depth to ledge or depth to bedrock is 6 inches down. And you find that out pretty quick with a shovel. And so, when you do that, the trees may grow, and you can see some stunted trees here in the foreground. That's actually a dead tree. Here's a stunted tree on the right, and then even back behind that, you see some stunted trees. That's because there's a ledge, and it may or may not be bedrock, but that's because there's rocks very close to the surface, and obviously that doesn't give enough room for roots to grow. You should look for a depth to impermeable layer of about 4 to 6 foot. And this includes water tables. Water tables may only be seasonal too. Water tables can sometimes get high in, maybe they're only high in the summer, maybe they're only high in the winter. It doesn't matter, it's still not great for chestnut. You still want something that's about 4 to 6 feet in depth, and I would avoid any site that has a seasonally high water table. Fragipan is another type of compacted area. This typically happens in more clay areas, and it's low in the surface. It could be 2 foot down, it could be 3 foot down, but that's where there's a clay layer that gets compacted because of typically activities on the surface of the ground. And so it's a subsurface layer. It restricts flow of water and root penetration. And so when you're looking at the kind of soil type that's on your ground, you want to see if it's prone to fragipan or not. And typically I recommend either not working in a soil that's prone to fragipan or subsoiling in order to break up a potential fragipan layer. Web soil survey. Web soil survey is not a perfect tool. It's a great approximation, and it's always the first place that I look. It's always the first place that I look to tell me what kind of soils you have on a given location. If someone writes me an email and says, I've got 1,000 acres, I want to plant chestnut. And the first thing I ask, well, where on that 1,000 acres? They say, well, I don't know, anywhere. And so you got to start asking yourself some of these questions, like, number one, do I want to plant in a forested site or a field site? Is it easy access for me to maintain the plantings that I put in? Can I get in and out really easily? Can I mow it? Is it going to be the type of planting that I'm going to mow or that I want to mow? Access is really important. And then if you really don't know and you don't care, well, then web soil survey is a great tool. Whether you've got 10 acres, a tenth of an acre, or 1,000 acres, it's a great tool to narrow down what areas look good and what areas look bad. The first thing, and I'm going to do a demonstration of this. So, but I just kind of wanted to lay out the certain things that you do in web soil survey. The first thing that you do is you draw a polygon. It can be a square or any kind of shape around the area that you want to look at, and that's called your AOI, or area of interest. Find your soil type, and then enter it into something called the Official Soils Description website, or OSD, and that's through the NRCS. And also Web Soil Survey is a service of NRCS. Once you get your AOI and you've read a little bit about your soil type, or you can do that after you've done this next step, do these next steps. Go into soil physical properties, look at your KSAT/permeability, look at the percent sand versus clay versus silt. Then go into soil qualities and features, look at your drainage class, your hydrologic soil group. This will tell you how much water the soil tends to hold. And then also look at that depth to impermeable or restrictive layer. And then finally look at the water features, and that's where your depth to water table will be held. All right, so I've got 3 different sites that I want to show you guys. I want to show you Scotia, which is Game Lands 176, and is behind my house. And so I live in Center County, Pennsylvania. It is a sandy soil. It's called Morrison, and there are just gobs of American chestnuts. They are all over the place. And so I wanted to show you kind of a site that we already know has lots of chestnuts, and what do those soil characteristics look like. And then beside that actually are some interesting locations where chestnuts don't grow. So let's look at those characteristics. I want to look at Game Lands 176, another portion of Game Lands 176, where we have a chestnut planting, and look at what happens when, And I also want to look at another site here in Central PA where the soil is all the same. It's all one soil type, but still there are certain portions where the trees grow well and they don't. So this is just to tell you that Web Soil Survey is a great first tool, but you really have to get in and know your site well to know exactly where trees may grow well and where they won't. And then another example of that is a long-term New York chapter orchard, the Zoar Valley or William W. White Orchard. That thing's been installed since the early 80s. And that's another sort of fascinating look at the difference between soil type, contour, and then also some maintenance controls. All right, so let's go to Web Soil Survey, see if this works. Okay, so when you go to, can you see that, Sharon? Does that look right? Web Soil Survey? Yeah, okay, good. So anytime you go to Web Soil Survey, you're going to start at this page and you click this green button that says Start WSS. All right, perfect. So you can do a couple things. You can take your, as with any mapping utility, you can just zoom in with your cursor. You can, in your address, or actually I think in latitude or longitude, you can just click to get current location, and that just zooms you in at your current place. You can use your address, and that's very convenient. You can use state and county, and that of course gives you a very broad scale look at what you're doing. And there's lots of different ways that you can zoom in into where you want to go and look. So let's see, I told you I wanted to go to Scotia. So let me get my cheat sheet here with these lat longs, which I just grabbed from, I grabbed them from Google Maps. All right, so let's throw that lat long in. All right, so this is Scotia Game Lands. You can see it's right up against a pretty residential area. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And then the area that I'm interested in is right here. Grab the hand. All right, so I know right here, this is 10-acre pond. I don't know if any of you guys know Scotia Game Lands or the history of Scotia, but this was a big iron ore mining area. And you're gonna see that pop up in these soil characteristics. And this pond is a somewhat of an artifact of that. So we'll see what Web Soil Survey says about a pond. But the chestnuts are all through here. This is an area called Patton Woods, and then also Scotia Barrens. And like I said, all of it's sandy, and I hope it, well, I know it because spoiler alert, I already looked. But this is all going to pop out as really sandy, sandy soils. So I'm going to grab the AOI tool. Remember I said the first thing you got to do is create an AOI. So that's your area of interest. And I'm going to draw a box. You can also draw a polygon. I'm going to draw a box just in this general area just to see what kind of soil types pop up. It creates the AOI. All right. The next thing that I do is click up here on the top. It says soil map. There's a tab. I'm going to click on soil map. And this just gives you an indication of what all kinds of soils are in your area of interest. All right. So I've got a lot of MRs. If I go over here, MRB, Morrison Sandy Loam, MRC, Morrison Sandy Loam. If you've never looked at soil types before, and then look, Leetonia sand, and there's a B and a C. A means it's basically flat. B means you're on 2 to 8% slopes. C means you're on 8 to 15% slopes. D means it's super, super steep. So that's all that means. So they're the same soil type. It's just that third letter tells you how steep that given contour is. So I've got lots of sand here. I've got Leetonia, I've got Morrison, and that comprises about 75% of what I got here. And then I've got this thing called Urban Land, Hagerstown Complex, and that's all here. And so what that means, you'll see that in places like if I go to New York City, and we've done plantings in New York City or Philadelphia or here, even where you would think, what is urban land doing here? And that's because it's an artifact of this mining that was done 150 years ago, actually, by Andrew Carnegie. So what this says is Web Soil Survey doesn't know. There's probably Hagerstown in there, but take anything that it says with a grain of salt because it's been mucked around with so much through development. Everything else, again, you still have to take it with a grain of salt, maybe not as much of this urban thing. And I can know more about it by looking at Hagerstown and looking at that specifically. But mainly what I'm looking at back here is Morrison, maybe a little Wyoming too, that there's kind of peek out here of Wyoming. But let's look at Morrison. If I click on that, it'll give me a pretty good overview. So what things do I want to look at? I want to look at the typical profile. So sandy loam, I don't see any clay there. All right, depth to restrictive feature, 72 to 99 inches to lithic bedrock. So that bedrock is a little shallow, but the chestnuts are still growing, so that's okay. It may not be where I would love to plant, but it's okay. It's well drained. And here's my KSAT, moderately high to high. Perfect. That's what I want. And sometimes you'll see very, rapid? Very rapid, and that's actually really good for chestnut. Hydrologic soil group A, perfect. D is very poorly drained. You don't want D, you basically want A or B. B is a little moderate. What else can we find out here? Map unit description. So this gives you a little bit more information about what that means. But this, again, very high level, what is Morrison? And it looks pretty good. Other things that I can do, I can go to this other tab, the Soil Data Explorer, and I can find out more things. And so I put that out in that last slide. I want to look at soil properties and qualities. So I click on that. I want to look at soil physical properties. Let's look at percent sand and see what it says. Usually, just for the easiest overview, I'm not going to click anything else. I'm going to click all layers. This gives the weighted average of the entire horizon. I'm going to click view rating. All right, let's see how much sand is in here. All right, boom, we've got 81, 81, 67. That's all in that sweet spot. But wait, we've got Lindside at 18%. Where are you? Ah, there it is. This red here. So Lindside. So I'm not going to plant there, but I'm curious about Lindside. Let's go back to the soil map and see what it says about Lindside. And click here. What does it say about that? So floodplain. All right, that doesn't sound good for chestnut. Silt loam. I don't see anything about sandy. Moderately well drained. That's not great. The KSAT's moderately high to high, so that's good. But it's not really well drained. It's in hydrologic soil group C. That's not good. Let's see. Now, what it's not telling you, and what I looked at before. Oh, here it is. Depth to water table. 18 to 36 inches. So that's not good either. So, for whatever reason, you've got this swale of limestone outcropping in the middle of all these sandstone derived soils. And, that's a great way to say, all right, I might plant something else on this Lindside soil, but I'm certainly not going to put chestnut, but pretty much all this other stuff, this Morrison and Wyoming is going to be great for chestnut. That depth to bedrock, though, I'm not going to know how deep that soil is until I dig or I plant and I see what happens. So let's go to another site. Let's go to Gamelands 176 because I want to show you what happens when you've got a soil that's okay. It's something called Hagerstown, and it's okay for chestnut, but you've got a swale right in the middle of it. All right, so let's go to the area of interest. I'm going to put in a different lat long. All right. And there it is. So here's the chestnut planting. So this is a chestnut planting that was put in 1997. Not doing great here for me. All right. And then it's surrounded by lots of pines. So I don't know if you can tell, but all these sticks are chestnuts. They're of various sizes and degrees of resistance. But right here, do you see this open spot? That's a deep swale that you wouldn't know until you went in and looked at the site, and trees never grew there. It just holds too much water. So let's do an AOI and just see what kind of soils, if there's any difference in soils. So instead of doing just a square, I'm going to make my own polygon. Just do that. All right, it's creating the AOI. I go to soil map. What do I see? Hagerstown silt loam. So it's all the same type. Well, Hublersburg too. Same silt loam. Hagerstown, Hublersburg. Let's click on that and see what it says. All right. So I've got silt loam. Well, just 9 to 70 inches. I got a silty clay right under there, so that's not great. 60 to 99 inches to lithic bedrock. That's not great. Moderately high to high. That's okay for my KSAT. It is well drained. That's good. I'm in B hydrologic soil group. So, in general, this isn't a horrible looking soil. And I would be a little scared by this B horizon of silty clay, but I don't know how far down it is. Until I dig down in and I see, is it 9 inches or is it 70 inches? If it's 70 inches down, I might be okay with that. If it's 9, I want to avoid that. And, that's what we found out when we planted this site, and we saw, okay, well, now we've got a huge dead spot right in the middle, and that's about 200 trees out of this 2,000. So that's about 10% of this planting. And again, this isn't a perfect chestnut site. It's okay, and the trees grow okay, but it's not great. All right, I'm going to move on. I think that's enough, and maybe we can answer more questions about web soil survey a little bit later, but that's a real quick overview of how to use it and what I look for. And we'll look at William White here in a minute in another way. So that's the web soil survey. That's talking about soil characteristics, your first approximation of, do I want to get in a site, and looking at soil texture, particle size, things like that. The next thing I want to look at is chemical composition. And so, like I said, these analytical labs can give you texture as well. You just got to pay a little extra. But most soil analyses are going to give you NPK. They're going to give you pH. They're going to give you something called CEC, the cation exchange capacity. At Penn State, they're $9 a kit, so not too bad. There are lots of other places. They usually run between $7 and $12. Sometimes I've seen them as high as $15 for a test. And it's great to do, just again, to set a baseline and see if you're going to have any issues from a chemical composition perspective or nutrient perspective. Let's see. The only way you're going to know the pH is to do a soil test. I mean, you can do it with those, you can have handy dandy kits where you can test it in the field, but I always recommend you do it by a lab. If it's below 4.5, you'll want a lime. If it's above 6.5, you can add sulfur to decrease it. That depends on how much effort and time you want to expend adjusting the pH or finding a better site. One interesting anecdote, there's a grower, he passed away last year in northeastern Ohio near Toledo, and he is on what's called Toledo yellow sand. It's great. It's well drained, perfect for growing trees. His chestnuts looked amazing as long as they were growing next to white pine. If they were not growing next to white pine, they were stunted, they were chlorotic, the leaves were all wilted, they were not producing chestnuts. And so the main reason for that is that the pH of Toledo yellow sand is 7. And so the chestnuts grew, but they didn't grow well. Why were they growing well next to white pine? And that's because the white pine, the needles of the white pine were acidifying the soil. And so he never actually had to add sulfur. He just used these white pine as nurse trees effectively. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen that a lot in areas where chestnuts grow really, really well next to white pine, and not just in areas that are naturally basic, but also even on acidic soils, white pine and chestnut grow together really well. So just a couple things to keep in mind. You may not have to sulfur if you have, test the pH, see what it is. Even in an area where the native pH of that given soil is high, it may have been amended by other natural processes. All right, NPK. Nitrogen is important for vegetative growth, and that's mainly what you're going to see on fertilizers. So like a 30-10-10, that's high nitrogen, moderate phosphorus, moderate potassium. All right, phosphorus is important for root growth and flower development, and then potassium is also important for flower and fruit development, as well as assisting in disease resistant. And most soils in the eastern U.S. are very low in phosphorus. That's not everywhere, but that's typically when you get back a report, most of them are going to say that you're real low in phosphorus. All right, chestnut response to nitrogen. Chestnut will respond very quickly to nitrogen. So on the right is a picture of Tim Phelps from long ago. I don't know if Tim's on here, but this is a picture from about 20 years ago, standing at one of the farms in Meadowview, Virginia. These trees are 2 years old. So Tim's about 6 foot tall. And these trees are about 12 foot tall at 2 years. And that's because lots and lots and lots of nitrogen was thrown down. So chestnuts, if you want lots of vegetative growth, if you want them to grow very tall, throw down a lot of nitrogen. It doesn't necessarily do much else for the trees, but it certainly gets them to grow fast. The tree on the left, this isn't a response to fertilizer, but I wanted to show you the potential of growth of the species. You see those 30 rings on the left, about an inch in size. So this tree grew about an inch in 30 years. It was suppressed in the understory. It was released. All the trees that were growing around it were cut down. It then grew about a half an inch in diameter a year for 8 years. So it more than tripled its growth after release, just from giving access to sunlight. So this is another thing to keep in mind. Where do I plant in a field? Do I plant in a forest? Chestnut trees will grow in the shade, but they will only grow fast with lots of sunlight. They will only flower with lots of sunlight too. All right, I'm going to skip all that because I feel like we're we're quickly approaching an hour, and I got other stuff to cover. This is an example of what the soil test results look like from Penn State. This is a site in Maryland. Let me see if I can move this and see it. All right, so our pH, we're high. We're up at 7, low phosphorus, low potassium, magnesium, calcium. This isn't a great site, but again, the pH I can amend. If the soil texture looks good, and I really love the site, and I definitely want to plant here, the CEC doesn't look bad, you know, I can amend most of these chemical issues. It depends on how much effort I want to put into it. And look at these messages. It says, here's what it recommends that you put down in order to get back to this optimum level. And the optimum level, there aren't specific recommendations for chestnut. You can ask for recommendations for blueberry. You can ask for recommendations, in this case, of a landscape to plant pH 5.5. And the recommendations are for that. They aren't for chestnut. They're for either blueberry or for getting it to a pH of 5.5. And that's close enough for us. We're not selling chestnuts commercially. We're just trying to get them to grow and hopefully get restored in the background. Maybe one day we'll have specific recommendations for chestnut, but we don't at this time. But the nice thing about these tests is that it'll give you a pretty good recommendation of what to do based on the soil chemistry of your given soil. All right, here's another site. This one's also in Maryland. All right, my pH is better. I'm at 5.7. That's good. I got lots of potassium. I'm optimum for phosphorus, so I actually don't have to do a lot on this site. It says, well, you know, you can throw down a 5-10-10, and that's fine, but you don't really need to. I've got a fairly moderate CEC there, which means nutrients are going to be somewhat available. You might want to put down some nitrogen because some nutrients might be tied up in the soil otherwise. But you know, again, these are pretty good low-level recommendations for what you might want to do, and it's not necessary for chestnuts to grow. This is just establishing a baseline, and especially to get that pH. All right. This is a site. This has been selected. There aren't that many trees here these days, or I don't want to show you the satellite map because we're down to like 5 or 6 trees. But what I want to show you here, this is a site that's all one soil type. It's all called Andover. Andover is not a great soil for chestnuts. I'm not going to go into detail. It just happened to be where we could plant them. It's out at what's called Ag Progress Days at Penn State. All one soil type. But we had lots and lots of death kind of here in the middle of the site. And if you were walking through, it would look a little different. You could really pick out the swale that's going through the middle of the site. And it's just a drainage path of water going right through, and the trees never grew. You got trees growing up on the swales. They never did great. This isn't a great soil, but they grew. And so again, that's the question. Do you want the trees to grow and live, or do you want them to grow really, really well? And so here's an example where the chestnuts lived, they grew, but I wouldn't say that I was ever impressed by their growth or their production. We were fighting this site all the time because it just wasn't a great site, but it was one that was given to us back in the late 90s. They said, hey, you know, plant here. All right, fine. It's easily accessible. We can do it. And we got what we needed out of the site, but if I had to do it over, I would have planted somewhere else. Let's look at William W. White Plantation. So these are really old satellite photographs from early 2000s. This is when this site was first established up in the Zoar Valley of New York. And so this is interesting. So we're starting to look at differences in not only soil type, but also contours, because you can see here, these yellow and oranges are the highest in elevation. Here is a little bit higher, and then you see lower elevations in these pinks and purples. All right, well, let's lay over the different soil types. All right, but it doesn't change necessarily with contour. We got to take both of those into account. And then if I throw on top of it the growth and survival of the trees at Zor, by far and away, my biggest trees are up on both the higher elevation and on this Arkport soil. That doesn't mean that it doesn't grow in other areas. It's growing in, let's see, oh, it's actually growing in a slightly, oh, sorry, this is my higher elevation of one soil, and this is a lower elevation, but of Arkport. So that's the difference. This is a low elevation here. It's a swale. So it'll grow on Castile, but only on the highest elevations. It'll grow pretty well on the highest elevations of Arkport, but it won't grow at all on the low elevations of Castile. And so again, the soil type is a great first approximation, but you have to know what the different undulations might be of a given site to know how well it's going to grow, or you just plant and cross your fingers and hope that it grows well. So this is the most recent satellite photo of William W. White. You can see there are still trees here in these areas that never really grew trees well. They are there, but by far and away, the best growth has been on these higher elevation areas and these different types of soils. All right. Resources for you. So Chestnut Growers website, which is something that I run, and I put as many resources as I can up there. Sharon has put all of these links on the Chestnut Chat website, so you can have quick access to that already. Penn State soil analysis, and I work at Penn State. That's what I use. There are other places that do perfectly fine work, so you're welcome to use other labs, but this is a fairly cheap and easy option. There's a great, so Larry Coons, another person who passed away last year, he was a horticulturalist at Penn State. He wrote a great circular for Penn State Extension called Fertilizing Woody Ornamentals. If you want to know everything that you should know about fertilizer and soil chemistry, I highly recommend this PDF, and Sharon's put that up on the Chestnut Chat website. It's a great way to, I mean, it's only like 10 or 12 pages. So it's a really fast read to get knowledgeable about soil chemistry. And again, web soil survey and the official soil series description. We didn't get into that, but I highly recommend the official soil series description to know more about what your particular soil site is. And again, first approximation of what your soils can or can't do and how suitable it might be for chestnut. All right, that was a lot. Let's see, we're at 12:15. I'm going to cover putting them in the ground really, really quickly, but we might want to do another session of actually planting and growing and maintaining trees, but I don't want to leave you all hanging of how you get these in the ground. I think some of you guys are getting ready to either plant seeds or seedlings now, or you already have. So I want to cover some site prep issues and some actually getting them in the ground. When you're selecting a site, we kind of talked about this before, are you going to put them in a field, or are you going to put them in the forest? And I get this question too, like, should I plant in a gap? Should I plant in a field? What's going to be best for restoration? Is it going to be planting 3 trees in where, a big tree fell down, or is it going to be a field of 1,000 trees? Should I plant it with a lot of other species, or should I plant in monoculture? And my answer is yes. I mean, all of these are going to play a role in restoration. Mainly what it comes down to is the soil, is the site suitable, and can you take care of it? And other than that, it doesn't really matter. There are advantages and disadvantages to all these other options. In a field, you have good access to light. You're going to get quicker fruiting because you have lots of sunlight. You don't have to clear. That's great. The downside is that you've got a lot of really highly competing vegetation that are hard to manage, and you typically don't have beneficial mycorrhizae that you find on forested sites. Forested sites depends on the amount of clearing that you've done as to how much light can get to a tree. I have some silviculture plots that were planted in a very heavy shelter wood, but there are still maybe 3 or 4 trees left per acre, seed trees left per acre. They still haven't flowered after 15, 16 years. And that's just because they're not getting full access to sunlight. So if flowering is something that you want, plant in a field. If you don't care and you just want them to grow, then leave some shade. The nice thing about forested sites, as long as you don't have invasive species, that's another presentation altogether. You typically have very little understory vegetation to manage. You often have beneficial mycorrhizae present, and that helps with growth. And then you have this interaction with the forest. Like I said, with that white pine interaction on that yellow sand, there's a lot of benefits to that. So it's going to be a trade-off as to whether you do a field or forest. And I'm not going to say one is better than the other. It depends on your given situation. You want to develop a timeline, you want to develop a budget, you want to, I mean, here in PA, New York, New Jersey, deer are going to be one of your biggest issues. And I'm sure it's the same case in other areas. It may not be an issue in some locations, but that's probably our biggest expense is managing deer. And in general, depending on the size of the planting you're going to put in, I'm going to say deer fencing or caging is going to be your best option. But that's another presentation. But it's going to take a lot to try and figure out what are the best options for me. If I do a forest site, do I need to clear? Do I need to clear trees? Do I need to remove stumps? Do I need to remove big rocks? Is there a lot of existing vegetation that I need to remove or manage? On a field site, what kind of herbaceous layer am I having to manage? Do I want to plow, till? I recommend all of those. Actually, you want to get rid of as much of that sod layer as possible because it's going to be a terrible competitor of trees. Grass is really tough to manage. And a lot of issues that I see with growers, even if they have a great site, is that they're not managing the vegetation. We recommend a 3-foot diameter weed-free area around chestnut trees for at least the first 5 years. You can do that with landscape fabric, you can do that with black plastic, you can do that with cardboard, you can do it with herbicide, but you want to get rid of grass particularly low because they just steal water and nutrients away from your trees while they're trying to get established. All right, getting the things in the ground. Field sites, their advantages, you can use big equipment. You can plow, you can disc, you can use a soil auger, you can use a post hole digger. You can also use hand equipment, but it's usually not necessary. It depends on your given site. But usually on fields, you're trying to scalp that sod layer off. You're really fighting against that. Now in forested or rocky sites, again, here in Rocksylvania, you may not be able to use a soil auger. There are sites where I was not able to use a soil auger because there's just too many rocks. There's not enough soil. The chestnuts grow phenomenally well, but actually getting them in the ground is very difficult. And in that case, I would actually rather just plant a seed with a little bit of handful of potting mix and have them take off rather than trying to dig a hole for a seedling. But again, it depends on your given situation and what you're trying to achieve. All right. Virtually anytime you're going to plant, you want a sterile weed-free planting mix. We often recommend, we do recommend a well-drained and acidic mix to match what chestnut likes. There's a mix that you can make your own, 1:1:1, peat, perlite, vermiculite. That works very well. It drains water very, very quickly. It's easy to make and mix, and it does very well. Commercial product, SunGrow Metro Mix 560 Suncore. I actually don't think they make that anymore. I'm going to have to update this recommendation and figure out what they call it now. But I think Scott's recently bought them out. And so they've restructured all of their naming. But basically, you want lots of organic matter. You want it well drained. A lot of these mixing companies will tell you what it's good for and what it's not. Lots of peat, lots of core, lots of porosity. All right. We also recommend, take a little bit of forest soil from underneath some oaks or even chestnuts, that can bring in some mycorrhizae. Not absolutely necessary, but it can help. All right, so what are your wildlife concerns? Are you going to have raccoons? Are you going to have voles? Are you going to have deer? Some of these you don't know until you have an issue. But in most cases, we recommend an 18 to 24-inch shelter of some kind. We recommend that you sink those shelters in as deep as you can. We typically recommend deer protection, and fencing generally is your best bet. Now, lots of people plant in tall tree shelters. We generally don't recommend them unless you have absolutely no other option. I did recently put a planting on a pipeline in Pike County, PA, and you can't put a fence on these pipeline areas. So we had to use tree tubes, 4-foot tall tree tubes. And so they work fine if you have no other option. But I generally recommend fencing or cages if you can get away with it. All right, planting supplies. So here's your post hole, post pounder, and generally that's to get stakes in the ground to hold your tree shelter. You can use wooden stakes if you want, but they do disintegrate relatively quickly compared to something like a fiberglass or rebar. Managing that vegetation. Here's Tom installing a chestnut seedling with weed fabric. So this is a square of weed fabric that's going to be used to control the vegetation. And that's great if you have no other option to get down in there, or if you want to go organic. Landscape fabric and mulch can attract voles and rodents, which can kill your trees. So you need to make sure that you're managing that if you're going to use landscape fabric or mulch. Herbicide, whether you want to use that or not, we typically use herbicide about twice a year. We spray down a broad spectrum herbicide, and sometimes we put down a pre-emergent as well, and that's very effective. If you're going to use herbicide, read the label, make sure you're following the laws and regulations stated by that label. All right. Make sure that you know what you're planting where. In most cases, so like we talked earlier, one of the folks on this call, Mike, is planting a GCO, a germplasm conservation orchard. What's going to be vital with that GCO is keeping the sources, knowing where they come from. And so we typically recommend planting 10 trees from each given source. So maybe it's 10 trees from Northwestern Connecticut and 10 trees from Eastern Connecticut and 10 trees from New York and 10 trees from Pennsylvania. We want to know where those come from. That's really, really important from our diversification standpoint. So keep track of where the trees come from, who mom and dad is, what the seed lot is, however you can, and label them. That's going to be an ongoing challenge. It is so hard to keep that. A good map is number one, but number two, actually labeling the trees in some way is something that you're going to be doing annually or every 2 years. All right, so if you've got a lot of different crosses, you need to mark out the layout, the planting, make sure you know that the right nut or right seedling is going in the right place. Typically recommend you do that prior to planting. Make a really good map, get all this documented, and make sure you know what has gone where on your particular planting area. All right, that's all about mapping. This is an Excel map, and that's fine. That's a great way, a great first start. We also have a program. It's an online database. It's called Dentatabase that we want more and more people using. And especially as we distribute more and more material, we've got a new module that's going to be out real soon that's going to allow you to plant just 3 or 4 trees in your backyard. We're very excited about that. But for now, we have the capacity to do big plantings and track them all in one place. You can do it on your phone, you can do it on a tablet, or you can do it on paper and then enter it in later. But the main thing is just document. Make sure you know where the trees come from and where they were put in your ground, especially when you do replacements. That is the hardest thing. Tree dies, you put another tree in. That's the hardest thing to track and what most people lose track of over time. All right. We also, there's lots of other things that you can track, lots of metrics that you can take at a minimum. Did it die? Is it alive or is it dead? And how much did it grow? That's usually the best thing that you can do, is to take those annually. There's lots of other things that you can take. You can take phenology, leaf out, flowering. Does it have blight or not? Was it attacked by deer? Was it attacked by critters? You can take all of that, but at a minimum, take individual by tree mortality and growth, and then work with your regional science coordinator. So Kendra's in New England, I'm in the Northern Appalachians, Tom's in the Mid-Atlantic, and Jamie is now in the South. And we can help you get this into database to track everything and make sure it's all organized and we know where everything is and where it comes from. Labeling your trees. So this is a blue X tube, and you can see the writing on the side. A Sharpie, I think this is a Sharpie will fade in a year. There are things called paint valve markers that can last between 3 and 5 years. I recommend those. You can actually use paint. You can use timber crayons. All of these things are temporary. None of them last forever. The aluminum tags are great. And in fact, I went to a site recently that was planted in 1999 and had these tags. Here's what happens if you don't move them. But if you do move them, so you can see it's girdled the tree and basically killed it because the aluminum wire wasn't moved. If you move them, they can last a very long time. Like I said, this planting in 1999, they're still there, they're still readable, but if you don't move them, they kill the tree. The downside is if you're in a very heavy porcupine infested area, the porcupines will eat that. So, and you may not know if you have porcupines until your tags are eaten. So just keep on top of that. All right. Watering is really important for establishment when you're doing seedlings, especially fully flushed seedlings. For those of you who put your nuts in pots and are about to move your fully flushed seedlings out into their final planting location, be prepared to water about a gallon per tree at the time of planting, and then per week after that, a gallon per week for about 4 weeks. That will get that fully flushed seedling established. Bare roots typically don't need watered. Seed planted trees typically don't need watered. And if you plant in the fall, water at planting, but it typically doesn't need it after that. Fertilizer, typically not necessary, but you can do it, and it can assist in growth, and it can improve your potential for flowering. It doesn't guarantee it. I typically recommend a granular fertilizer because it's easy, and it's harder to over fertilize with a granular fertilizer. All right, management recommendations. We already talked about weed-free area. Recommend keeping that 3-foot diameter area weed-free to keep competition around from the base of the tree. I'm going to stop it there. I'm already an hour in. Let's see how many questions we have. All right. Sharon, did you see anything that popped up that I should know of right off the bat? No? All right, let's see. All right, I got lots of questions here. Did anyone thumb up a question? All right, Frank, question, part comment. We planted in an area that did have a high sand content, did okay until we got a dry spell that didn't work out well. They absolutely do not do well in wet soil. You can get very wet soil even on a small ridge. I think it was under a layer of clay. Soil type can change rapidly. Yeah, all true. Mid-slope has worked best for us. I agree. That's a good point. All right, do squirrels do detailed soil surveys? They seem to find the right place for planting a lot of different trees. Well, but they plant a lot, and I don't think you see their failures as much as you do that you do. All right, let's see. In Tucker County, West Virginia, I've been planting chestnuts from seeds and seedlings for 30 years. Used to be chestnuts all over the woods here, and soil is well drained, but all have died 3 to 15 years because of blight. I've decided to stop trying until a resistant tree is available. When will that be? Soon. We hope very soon. We do, and there is some resistance in backcross material. It depends on the background that you've got and the line that you've got. The transgenic material does have what looks to be pretty high resistance, and that's going to depend on when deregulation happens. And optimistically, we're hoping that happens in 2022. It could happen sooner. We don't know. That's all going to depend on regulators. All right. Marty Jessel, make sure the vermiculite is asbestos free. Pure vermiculite does not contain asbestos and is non-toxic. Very good. Thank you, Marty. I appreciate that. Speaking of germplasm orchards, do you happen to know if there are any in the Carolinas or other ACF plantings? Yes, there. Virtually every chapter has a GCO. Some older than others. In Pennsylvania, they've been planting GCO since 1997. In Carolinas, there was one at Cataloochee. There's a couple in Tennessee. So yeah, we've got quite a few wild type. There's a couple great ones in Indiana with Purdue. There's some great American collections in most states. And we're always looking for more. All right. Let's see. Quotation mark. There was something that I got for contributing extra money to the foundation. Oh, you were asking. So yes. So if you joined the Chestnut Foundation at the sponsor seed level. So basically, when you sponsor the American Chestnut Foundation's research, as a thank you, we give seeds out. Those are B3F3s. We have no guarantees as to what they are. But like I said, as far as documentation, all of those seeds come with a label of their background and where they come from. And that's really important to keep. And we can tell you more about your given tree's background and how it performed if you keep that label with it. And we've done a lot of genotyping since we started doing this. We know more and more about which lines are good and which lines are not. And so if you let us know, or even if you get into database, we can start telling you more and more about how good your tree's parents are and perform. All right, let's see, we're getting through here. Is there an easy way to test the pH of our soil? Send it in to a soil analysis lab is the easiest way I know. You can get a soil testing pH kit and do it yourself, but I would recommend sending it away to a lab. For $9, they give you a lot of really good information, and I say that's the easiest way to do it. What role does the element calcium play in soil composition for chestnut trees? You know, I don't know. Sharon, I'm sorry, I can hear you type in there. Just FYI. So what role does element calcium play in soil composition for chestnut trees? I don't know. Calcium specifically to chestnut, I don't know for sure. So sorry, I can't answer that. Steve, hi Steve. On old farmland, planting stopped 1930, compacted layer 2 to 3 inches thick at 14 inches below the surface. Is this fragipan? Yes, it is. That is so. You can get that up though. You can subsoil and break up that fragipan. And it looks like, so Tyler Payne put something, a link in the chat. We'll have to check that out. But yeah, if you can subsoil that, that'll get rid of that hard pan. All right. Clark, I thought you said, oh wait, I lost it. I thought you said that you wanted a depth to bedrock over 4 or 6 feet, but later you talked 60 to 99 not being ideal. They're all ranges. I mean, you're right, Clark. I mean, ideal is 4 to 6 feet. And we know that mainly from our mineland plantings. When you're ripping up a really, really super compacted soil like a mineland soil, you want to rip down 4 to 6 feet. That doesn't mean that the trees won't grow in areas with shallower bedrock or shallower restrictive layer. You're just kind of playing the odds as to how well they'll do and for how long. Generally, the deeper your soil, the longer the trees will grow and the taller the trees can grow. So 99 inches is okay. I wouldn't necessarily go over a site because of that, but with every inch that you get an impermeable layer closer to the surface, you're harming the productivity of your given planting, if that makes sense. All right. Will chestnut trees grow well where oak trees thrive? It depends on the oak tree, and I wouldn't use that necessarily as a line. There's so many different oak species. You know, swamp white oak, I wouldn't plant there. You know, live oak, might not plant there, but you know, most white oaks, most chestnut oaks, chestnut trees grow well in those types of locations, but most oak trees have a wider capacity, a wider range of sites in which they can grow than chestnut does. So I wouldn't use that as a general rule. Do you recommend soil food web analysis or mycorrhizae analysis? I don't know what those are, Alan. I'm sorry. If you could elaborate, I might be able to hone in on that. All right, let's see. Harry Tenney, just curious, is it true that individuals from the Virginia Division of Forestry came upon a grove of American trees in Wisconsin, allegedly seeds brought by Civil War veterans? So there was a site in Wisconsin, that was the West Salem site. That might be that site that you're referring to. So that was 9 seeds brought by what we think are settlers from Pennsylvania, planted in about 1900. They grew amazingly well. They grew to tremendous size. It was 9 trees that grew up to 30 acres of chestnut. One of the best sites where we can study, where we were able, notice I see a lot of past tense, where we were able to study chestnut recruitment. That site did get the blight in the mid 80s and has since, virtually every tree is now blighted and gone. All the big trees are gone, at least. So that might be what you're referring to, Harry. All right. It seems like the questions never end. All right, Pauline, this is for Sarah. I found the Cornell soil testing site. You answered the fall planting question I had. Great review. I used to work for USDA Soil Conservation when we used manuals, no internet. Yes, Pauline, when I first started, I was using the soil manuals and they were great, but I'm so happy to have them online. It makes my job so much easier. Bernie asks, can you discuss newspapers for mulch? Sure, yeah, they work. And if you shred them up really well, you can use them as a mulch. Just be aware with any mulch, be it bark or newspaper or cardboard, it can harbor rodents that can chew the base of your tree. So be careful when you're using that. But they work to varying levels. Let's see, recommendations for vole control, particularly with orchards planted in fabric. John, it depends on how bad your voles are. In some cases, you can use physical barrier protection, like sinking something around the base of the tree, and that can control them. In some cases, making sure that the area is mowed well so that flying creatures and foxes can find the voles and eat them. So you can sometimes rely on predation to control your vole populations. In areas here in State College and some areas in New Jersey where we have just terrible vole problems, we use trap and baits, chemical control, and it is not a pleasant substance. It can kill non-target specimens, and I don't use that lightly, but in some cases it's your only option. They're a zinc oxide background, I think is what they are. Volmax and Molmax and things like that. Do chestnuts prefer a particular geographically oriented slope on a ridge? No, and that's a great question. So based on all that habitat suitability analysis, and whenever I've planted, I see no preference of aspect slope. Now, Frank did say he tends to see them perform better mid-slope, and I would agree with that. But based on an overall analysis, region-wide, we didn't see that pop out as being important to chestnut, current chestnut growth. Does the American Chestnut Foundation have any contacts with Dixon Springs Ag Center or University of Illinois? No, not at this time, but Otis, if we should, please let us know who we should contact and how to work with that contact. John Harrington, regarding my earlier question about maintenance, we do have multi-year contracts which help with establishment. After that, just mowing lawns. Yeah, I mean, mowing lawns, that definitely helps control lots of things too. Underground fencing for voles, I don't know about that. I have not read about that. If it works, that's great, but I can't speak to it personally. What about a planting where you have dead for 10-year 30-foot chestnut trees and no sprouts? So sometimes, so Becky, I don't know exactly what, but I have seen that where you have trees that grow to 30 foot and then just die for no apparent reason. And it wasn't blight. If you can definitely rule out blight, and sometimes I've seen Chinese chestnuts do this, where they got to 30 foot tall, even 40 foot tall, or they got to 25, 30 years old and they died. And actually the problem was a relatively shallow impermeable layer. Bedrock was only 2 foot down, 3 foot down, and that was the main reason. It appears to be that was the main reason the trees died. Roofing nails will hold aluminum tags for decades. The large head moves out with the bark. That's true, and I've seen that on big trees. That is a great entry point for blight, though. So on tree, like especially if you're planting a GCO with American chestnuts, I don't recommend that method, but it will work for other trees, especially big trees. How deep do chestnut trees go? It depends on your site. So we've only ever dug up a couple of trees, and the taproot went down about 4 foot in a site that was that deep. So they can go down 4 or more feet based on their age, and that's another reason why we make that recommendation. If they can't, then they stop. Based on if there's a fragipan or they don't like the soil, if there's too much clay, they won't go down that deep. Let's see, my area of interest is showing Bennington silt loam or Cardington silt loam. Is that good? I don't know. I need to look that up, but look at the different specific factors of that soil. Does it have 25 to 75% sand? Does it have high saturated hydraulic conductivity? Is it a deep soil? Is there a high water table, which you don't want? Look at all those factors and then kind of put them together and send me an email. Maybe we can talk about that offline. Resources in Wisconsin. Not at this time. We don't have anyone directly in Wisconsin. There is the Savannah Institute. The Savannah Institute, we have colleagues there, and they're working on trying to develop agroforestry protocols, especially for Chinese chestnut. They're probably the first local person that I would reach out to for chestnut in that area. Let's see, advice on bugs that may harm early growth. Joe, it depends on the bug. Generally, I recommend making real good friends with your local extension agent because they'll know what kind of bugs you're dealing with and how to control it. And really the control depends on the kind of bug that's affecting it. Is it gypsy moth? Is it, which is terrible? Is it something else which you may not be able to, which you may not have to control? You really need to identify what the critter is before you enact any control. Should you wait until fall to plant potted seedlings? It depends. I mean, it depends on your case, where you are, how bad the weather is. I mean, we've done a lot of spring planting, we've done fall planting. I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other. It just depends on your situation and how long you can keep that tree in a pot, or want to keep that tree in a pot. And then once you plant it, how much effort can you put into that tree that you planted? If you can follow up with that planted tree and give it lots of water, plant it now. If you can't, if it's going to go out into the middle of a field and burn up and you're not going to get water to it, then I'd wait until fall. All right. Does American chestnut have promise for environmental remediation or phytoremediation work? Since the tree grows quickly, can the tree be used to pull up pollutants from the soil? We don't know yet. We do have lots and lots of chestnuts on the Palmerton site. So that's a super fun site in Eastern PA. And that was a zinc, high zinc area that was used to smelt zinc, I guess. And so it basically denuded the entire mountainside. I recommend you look it up. It's a really fascinating story. So we've got lots of chestnut growing there with lots of other species. And we don't know yet exactly how well they're doing, but hopefully we'll get good answers to that relatively soon. They do look good in general. What weeks are wild trees blooming in Vermont and New Hampshire? Usually across the range, usually you're in June and July as you go further. So here in Central PA, the last week of June, first week of July is sort of your sweet spot. Depending on where you're at in Vermont, New Hampshire, you're probably looking at last week of June, first couple of weeks of July is going to be your sweet spot for blooming trees. All right. You guys have lots of great questions. Ordinary citizen here, who can obtain and plant genetically modified chestnuts? At this time, nobody. You're gonna have to wait for it to be deregulated. And again, like I said, that we hope that happens by 2022. It might happen earlier, it might happen later, but we just don't know the answer to that question. It's in the hands of the regulatory agencies at this point. Do chestnuts prefer a particular geography? Oh, I answered that. All right. Oops. John Harrington, previously planting had to be in a monitored, curated setting. I work for a big water supply agency that does not have such a maintenance program. Oh, John, I see this is related to the other question. I'm an architect in New York City. Can we include chestnuts if we don't do follow-up maintenance? Yes, you can. And again, it depends on how much follow-up maintenance you have to do depends on what is going to attack your tree. And so depending on what's going to attack your tree, like especially vegetative competition, grass and things like that. If you're going to have a lot of grass competition, I wouldn't recommend, and you can't follow up on it, then I wouldn't recommend planting. If you're in a forested area or you have something that can control that, or you can follow up on it without, just to make sure that it hasn't died or that the voles aren't getting to it or that people aren't knocking it over, that can be fine. We do have successful plantings in New York, in the city, in Brooklyn. We used to have one in Central Park, but it's since blowed over. We've got a big planting at Highbridge. So there's various ways. We can talk more, John, if you want to, about your particular situation and what might work and what might not. Let's see. All right, I did that one. I'm Chad. I'm following TACF as a representative for the North Central Forest Landowners Association, encompassing forest owners in a 4-county area. The last chat, someone mentioned a planting near Austin. Our group is interested in doing something like that. Can you forward any contact info for local work? So up there, that would be me. So yeah, Chad, shoot me an email and we'll talk about doing something up there. Oh, Katie Barnhill-Dilling. Hi, Katie. Obviously, these biophysical parameters are critical for chestnut planting, particularly with respect to planting oxo tree in coming years. How might we integrate social criteria with biophysical to reflect the ways in which restoration is also a socio-cultural process? I mean, absolutely. I think that's really important, in terms of setting priorities. And this isn't quite what your question is, but I mean, we definitely have issues of, is the land owned public or private? Who is the type of landowner? Is it, for example, a tribal landowner, or is it going to be a corporate landowner? Is it a paper company? I mean, all of that is important to know in terms of, what's going to be the best place for these trees to go, and who's going to welcome, a certain planting. So I think that there's absolutely a place for that, and it would just be a matter of putting that into a model and getting someone to do that. How much confidence can I have in Soil Explorer estimates? I often find that it lists a single area as having 50% or more of one type and 30% of another. I'm not sure what to do with that information. Tyler, that's a great question. And it's a first approximation. I mean, really, it's all of that is extrapolated based on, a few number of soil pits. So it's not exact. And that the lines that are on there, they look like they're really strict delineations, and they're not. The confidence is, yes, I can use that as a first approximation to say, yes, I'll look more deeply here, or no, I'm not going to look more deeply in that location because it doesn't look very promising at all. But once you have that, go in and do a perk test, dig that hole a foot deep and a foot wide and see how fast the water goes through. Plant a couple of trees, plant 10 or 20 trees in a given area and see how well they do. Those are the best ways you're going to know how well that's going to do. And you can work out a lot of kinks before you go and plant in a big planting. That's usually what I recommend. Use web soil survey as your first go. Do soil pits, do an actual small planting, and then, a couple years later, after you've gathered a lot of information, then plant a big planting. You'll do a lot better and work out a lot of kinks and save a lot of heartache if you do it that way. Let's see, Frank, tough one here. Oh, comment, this is one tough tree. It can compete with grass, brambles, etc. I have had trees that look dead only to resprout and start to grow. I sometimes think genetic variability is as important as the site. I agree. I mean, I think the site is actually, they go hand in hand. You need good genetics on a good site, but your tree is going to have a better chance if you pick a good site. Anyone interested in growing American chestnuts as bonsai? I've heard people want to do that. I mean, I think that's interesting if people can do it. I've had a couple of people try it and they weren't very successful. But I don't know anything about bonsai. Water table is 6 to 12 inches, even on a hilltop. Any advice if I should continue with orchard plans? Bob, I probably would not. But let's depending on where you're at, if you're in PA, Jersey, New York, Indiana, Ohio, let me know, and maybe we can look at it a little bit more closely and see if it's worthwhile or if you should find another site. But based only on that information that your water table is 6 to 12 inches down, I would not plant chestnut there. Wouldn't chemical poisoning of voles also affect the foxes or coyotes that might keep voles under control? Yes, and Robert, that's exactly why I don't like to use it. But and why I try not to use that first. I try to see if predators can take care of the problem first, because you do have collateral damage with these poisons. But sometimes the predators aren't doing the job, and you need to control them with poisons, and that's unfortunate. Companion planting, which forest species should you avoid planting near? Well, I mean, walnut, because of the jug loan, and also because walnut tends to like wetter soils. That's the major one that I mean, sycamore, because generally, not because it's a bad tree, but because willow, because these are generally species that show that it's a very wet site. Walnut's really the only one that I can think of that has any sort of allelopathic effect. Ailanthus is said to, but I wouldn't want to plant near Ailanthus anyway. I would try and get rid of that as quickly as I could, scrub it out, and then replant with something of more value. If Chinese chestnuts grow well in a site, is that a good indicator that American chestnuts will do well? Jay, yes, to an extent. Chinese chestnuts generally can handle wetter soils than American chestnuts can, and American chestnuts can generally handle drier soils. So there is some overlap there where they grow well on the same sites, but Americans can handle drier sites and Chinese can handle slightly wetter sites. I hope that answers your question. Frank says, is it better to start with smaller or larger trees? I have seen seedlings that stay small for several years and then decide to grow and seem ultimately to do better. Do they form a better root system if they stay small? I see a lot of oaks do that as well. It depends. It depends on your particular site and how long you can nurse along a small tree. It depends on the genetics. You know, a lot of small trees start out small because they have a small nut. You will get a larger tree from a larger nutted tree. So, I mean, yes. Some people only plant really large seedlings. And in some cases, like I said, if I'm planting in northern New Jersey or Pennsylvania in the middle of rocks, I can't get a big seedling in. I'll only be able to plant a small seedling. And in fact, I would rather just put a nut in the ground and protect it. So it really depends on your given situation. Let's see, we got about 10 minutes to go. I'm going to keep answering questions. If you guys want to stick around, that's great. Can you talk more about the transgenic approach and potential for success? Track development of that for a while, but lost track. John, we have a whole Chestnut chat devoted to that. Sharon, can you remember or put in the chat maybe which one that was? It was the third or fourth one that goes into great detail about that approach, and I recommend you checking that one out. It'll give you everything you need. And then as far as the regulatory work, you know, like I said, you got to get it deregulated by the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA, and that's going to take at least another year. We think it could be longer, it could be shorter, but I wouldn't expect anything before 2022. Any suggested Ohio source for trees? I'm approved for an orchard grant and we'll be filling about 2 acres. This is in north central Ohio. It depends. You mean like American chestnuts? Shoot me an email. I'll see what we can do. There's Empire Chestnut Company in Carrollton, Ohio, and Greg Miller is a longtime member and grower with the American Chestnut Foundation. That would be the first place I would go. But it depends on what you're looking for necessarily, if you're looking for things other than chestnuts. I found that Brad says, I found that indoor grown potted seedlings are susceptible to leaf scorch when moving outside and should be hardened via gradual outside exposure before planting. Is this typical or expected? Yes, absolutely. You want to harden them off for about 2 weeks in the shade before moving them out into the harsh sun. Quick update on the status of pilots and spotters searching for new chestnut blooms this season. Steve, I think folks are doing that in Kentucky, but that's the only people that I know are definitely following through with that. And in the meantime, we're trying to develop protocols of how to do it. That's the focus this season, and then hopefully we'll actually follow that protocol next season in 2022. Do you recommend a specific fertilizer for chestnut? I don't. It really depends on, thanks Sharon. Sharon put in the chestnut chat number 3 that's specifically on transgenic. So check that one out, and it's been recorded and you can get everything you want to know about it from that chat. So do you recommend a specific fertilizer? I don't. I mean, it really depends on your location, what your chemical composition is, and what your chestnuts need. I mean, 10, 10, 10, you know, 10 to 10 to 10 is usually a very you know, all-purpose fertilizer that can, you know, feed your plants and get them going. We don't fertilize most of our plantings. It's generally not necessary, but if you think they need a little bit of extra food, or you're on a higher pH and you want to give them a little extra help, that does fine. Suggestions for fertilizer application in the fall. How far from stem for a 1-year-old seedling? It depends on the fertilizer you're using. Read the label on the bag and apply as they recommend, because they all have different recommendations depending on what you use. Rick says, I have many native chestnuts on my property. At best, the native trees grow to 4 inches in diameter and die, but most stumps just put out new shoots, which die after a few years. How far away from these should I plant new plantings? Rick, it doesn't matter. You can plant right up next to them. You can plant, you know, 100 yards away. You can plant 5 miles away. The proximity to those native sprouts really doesn't matter from a blight perspective. Now, if you plant near those sprouts, that means you've got a site that's suitable for chestnuts. So I would probably recommend putting a new planting as close to them as possible, because that means that the site is suitable. Blight is going to happen no matter what. It doesn't matter your proximity to chestnut trees. It might delay when blight gets in there, but your trees are going to get a blight eventually, no matter what. So that's why you need resistance or some other tool to fight off the infection. What's your favorite impossible planting but grew story? Oh, Hope, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that one. I'd say the Mineland sites, honestly, Hope. Like when you go to some of these Mineland sites and they look like either or even a planting I did in northern New Jersey. So many of these Mineland sites that look like a moonscape. It's just rocks. And when you dig it up and you just uncover giant, like literal car-sized boulders, and or you're planting in what looks to be a pile of rocks, and they grow. And I recently visited a site that's in Schuylkill County, PA, in Tremont, and it was on literal car-sized boulders. And I was planting these trees in these spaces with what looked to be hardly any soil at all. And we planted a bunch of nuts and bare roots, and they grew. I mean, they're 25, 30 feet tall, and they were planted in 2012. So they haven't grown tremendously well, but they grew. So there are some pretty miraculous sites out there. And then I'd say another site is Central Maine in Atkinson, where we do a lot of work looking at recruitment and natural regeneration. This is a site where you have a lot of hummocks growing out of sort of wetland areas, and I would never, ever, ever choose to plant there. But squirrels planted the nuts, and in some cases they grew. But if you try to do an orchard, you'd have most of them die. But it's things that just got a foothold on a hummock in the middle of basically a swamp, they grew fine. So, like I said, all of these guidelines are just that. Trees can grow in certain clay areas. Trees can grow in pHs that are high or very low. It's just a matter of, maximizing the potential of growth and productivity. Hope, I'm going to end on that question. I think that was a great way to end. I appreciate it. And everybody else, thank you so much for joining us this week. Sharon, thank you for your help. I really appreciate it. And so next month we're going to go again. June 18th is going to be pollination, speed breeding. We're going to have Tom Clack from the University of New England and Dakota Matthews from SUNY ESF are going to talk primarily about controlled pollination and getting geared up for that. So I guess we'll end it there. Thanks for listening to me for an hour and a half, and we'll see you again next month.